Members, that takes us to non-government business. Misuse of Drugs Amendment, Lawful Personal Use of Cannabis Bill 2024. The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. I move that a bill for an Act to amend the Misuse of Drugs Act 1981 to make it lawful for an adult to possess small quantities of cannabis for personal use, make it lawful for an adult to cultivate not more than 6 cannabis plants for personal use, permit an adult lawfully in possession of cannabis to give the cannabis by way of a gift to another adult and for related purposes, be introduced and read for a first time.
Members, the question is the bill be read a first time. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. The ayes have it.
Misuse of Drugs Amendment, Lawful Personal Use of Cannabis Bill 2024, first reading.
It was a silent aye.
The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
President, I move that the bill be read a second time. Now, much can be said about the need for parliamentarians to serve and protect the people whom we represent. One example might be the need to address potential harms caused by substances that ought to be properly regulated. We have legislation in this respect regarding medicines, restricted medicines, poisons, harmful agents and illicit drugs. For decades now, governments of both persuasions have almost uniformly subjected the population to a strict ban in relation to cannabis, fearing that this substance may be entirely harmful without any discernible medical benefit. Since legalisation of cannabis for medical purposes alone in 2016, that ban is now clearly without merit. There remains, however, a clear discrepancy in the law whereby the cannabis plant, even if prescribed by a doctor for medical reasons, when grown at home, is unlawful. We are well aware of the widespread use of cannabis as a homemade medication, usually consumed to address either mental health issues, such as anxiety, or physical problems, such as chronic pains. Only last year, I tabled a list of more than 4,000 recent internationally conducted academic studies which consistently demonstrate the clear benefits of both recreational and prescribed cannabis for a wide range of conditions. Close examination of those studies reveal little or no evidence of a meaningful distinction between the two types. These same studies also highlight an absence of enhanced risk of adverse effects when either form of cannabis is used in moderation. The 2021 election brought 2 elected members of Parliament to the Upper House with a mandate to legalise cannabis. Together with the reported 78% of the population supporting at least decriminalisation of cannabis, this suggests a clear and pressing need to review our current legislation. The bill now before the House seeks to place cannabis in a more secure position, appropriate to its social and societal benefits, while also mitigating the possible risks that misuse might cause. The legislation can be broadly broken into 2 areas: easing access to specific amounts of cannabis grown legally within the private premises, and ensuring that the physical and mental safety of minors is protected by excluding them from contact with cannabis, in the same or better ways than children are protected from access to alcohol and tobacco. The details can be outlined as follows. Firstly, on royal assent, it will be legal to possess up to 50 grams of cannabis for personal adult use. This is not an absolutely new provision, as the Gallop government did in fact decriminalise the possession of small amounts of cannabis. Indeed, I note that this is still the official position of the State Labour Party, as evidenced in the most recent 2023 policy document. Recreational use of cannabis has always been part of social structure. Indeed, over half of the population has tried it at some point in time, and about 10% of the population consume cannabis on a regular basis. Use of cannabis has a wide range of definitions, but it is recognised that for regular use, it is abundantly clear that limiting the number of plants to 2 is insufficient. The intent of this bill is to allow for homemade remedies to be prepared with sufficient supply to last for the duration of treatment, thereby greatly reducing the need for the individual to rely on illicit sources. By extension, this reduces the burden on our police force, reduces the criminal element in supplying cannabis, and allows for enhanced attention being paid to those same criminal elements supplying illicit drugs or trafficable quantities. The bill will allow a person to grow up to 6 cannabis plants at an adult's principal place of residence, indoors or outdoors, to share or gift up to 50 grams of cannabis, and to possess and use up to 50 grams of cannabis in private, or the quantity derived from the 6 plants, without an offence being committed. The Legalise Cannabis Party WA entered Parliament in 2021 with an election commitment to deliver this bill. Public support for the intent of the bill has been repeatedly demonstrated. At the same time, however, responsible legislators will also ensure sensible safeguards for public safety and health. The bill demonstrates in the succeeding clauses the measures taken to achieve that aim. Clause 4 amends Section 5 of the Act, which provides for offences relating to premises and utensils used in relation to prohibited drugs and prohibited plants. Under this legislation, a person does not commit a simple offence under subsections of this bill by reason only that the premises are being used for the preparation, use or supply of cannabis or cannabis plants, in circumstances that are lawful under new Part 3A, Division 4, as inserted by the bill. A major need for amendment to the Act rests on the current risks inherent in cultivating a plant that is to be used for recreational and medical purposes without good management of the plant. In medical terms, this can be described as harm minimisation, but in effect, we are implementing safe practice. Hydroponic cultivation, when used correctly, provides a safe outcome for personal use, and this would also now become a lawful act in the new Part 3A, Division 4. Logic dictates that with lawful cultivation of a plant for personal use, often on a regular basis and to mitigate low-level health issues, references to offences regarding drug paraphernalia also need to be amended. Clause 8 inserts new section 7b(8), providing that a person does not commit an offence under several subsections regarding the display, sale or possession of drug paraphernalia in circumstances that are now lawful under new Part 3A, Division 4, as inserted by the bill. It should come as no surprise to members to discover that the Legalise Cannabis Party requires a strong emphasis on safety of minors. Clause 9 and subsequent clauses provide amendments addressing the requirements to ensure the safety of minors. While adults are deemed to have maturity in their personal decisions to use cannabis, minors who are found to be illicitly using cannabis are still liable for management under the cannabis intervention requirement. It is made clear that all of Part 3A, Division 2 of the Act will only apply to young persons and not only Section 8G as it does prior to the amendments. In particular, the bill in Clause 15, inserting the new Section 8MG1, confirms that it is an offence for an adult to smoke cannabis so that a young person is either passively exposed to or actively can smoke or inhale the smoke or fumes of the cannabis. Sensible exclusions also ensure that no injustice is caused under particular conditions. When it comes to gifting cannabis, the bill takes the same approach as that of a beer drinker. Not everyone has the time, skill or inclination to brew their own beer, and a friend might share their output. In like manner, growing cannabis for personal use is not as easy as one might think. The new Section 8MH will make it lawful for an adult to supply or offer to supply cannabis to another adult if the supply is not for payment, reward, consideration, barter exchange or compensation, and the quantity of the cannabis being supplied or offered for supply does not exceed 50 grams. With these same sensible amendments, it would also be lawful for an adult to supply or offer to supply no more than 6 cannabis plants to another adult. In effect, these provisions allow the gifting of cannabis and cannabis plants within the lawful limits for personal use and cultivation under the preceding provisions of the division. Members will recall the efforts to enact legislation recommended by the eminent legal mind of the Honourable Wayne Martin, AC, KC, whose long-awaited amendments still languish on a desk somewhere in the bowels of bureaucracy. Under Section 32A(1), the following additional subsections rectify this situation, something that the Law Society would like to see implemented. Subsection 32A(1)(a) gives a court discretion in relation to the declaration of a person as a drug trafficker in relation to cannabis, if the court is satisfied that it would be clearly unjust to do so, having regard to the circumstances of the commission of the offence and of any other matter the court considers relevant. Subsection 32A(1)(b) requires a court to give reasons if it, because of subsection 32A(1)(a), chooses not to declare a person to be a drug trafficker in relation to cannabis. A new division has been inserted in Part 7, Roman 7, Division 3, Provisions for Misuse of Drugs, Lawful Personal Use of Cannabis, Amendment Act 2024. Now that adult possession and use of cannabis has been defined as lawful under the provisions of the bill, there is need to regulate for an orderly transition. This pertains to the circumstances and requirements for managing a cannabis infringement notice, which might already be in place on the day of the amendments coming into effect in relation to an adult. Any such CIN will cease to be enforced from that date. This reflects the fact that the possession of or use of cannabis or possession of drug paraphernalia for which a CIN was issued would be lawful under the amendments to the Act when they come into effect, and so there will be no public policy benefit in pursuing compliance with a previously issued CIN. Finally, amendments have been made to the schedules determining the court of trial or the presumption of an intent to sell or supply should the legal limits be overstepped and criminal behaviour be recorded. Consideration was given to the nature of the provisions in the context of cannabis, and after due consideration and advice, it was thought more appropriate to determine the quantity of cannabis by weight, not by number of cigarettes. Over the course of 3 years, members on all sides of the House have had the opportunity to listen to the opinions, facts, explanations and scientific data that underpin the rationale for the introduction of this bill. It must surely be abundantly clear to all that there is a groundswell of support for the measures implemented in the amendments. That support comes not only from 4/5 of the citizens of our state, but also from legal offices and societies. I note the record of Hansard from 2002 and my discussions with individual police officers on the beat, and that indeed many of our serving officers agree with the move to legalise cannabis. Valiant efforts to protect our society are diluted by efforts to chase down a plant in a failed war against drugs. This bill does more than rectify an almost century-old injustice. It will assist in regulating use of a common and popular nutrient, reduce the influence of the criminal element, permit the thin blue line to focus on far more pressing issues, reduce the extent of alcohol-induced violence, including the vile scourge of domestic violence, reduce the extent of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a crisis of national importance, especially amongst the populations in remote and rural areas and indigenous populations. And it will enhance social peace and the rule of law and order. Pursuant to Standing Order 1261, I advise that this bill is not a uniform legislation bill. It does not ratify or give effect to an intergovernmental or multilateral agreement to which the government of the state is a party, nor does this bill, by reason of its subject matter, introduce a uniform scheme or uniform laws throughout the Commonwealth. I commend the bill to the House and I table the explanatory memorandum to the bill.
That explanatory memorandum is tabled and debate on that bill stands adjourned. Members, we move to item 2 of non-government business, Legalise Cannabis Referendum Bill 2024. The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
President, I move that a bill for an act to provide for a referendum on the question of legalising cannabis in specific circumstances and for related purposes be introduced and read a first time.
Members, the question is the bill be read a first time. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary say no. The ayes have it.
Legalise Cannabis Referendum Bill 2024, first reading.
The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Thank you, President. I move that the bill be read a second time. The purpose of the Legalise Cannabis Referendum Bill 2024 is to provide for a referendum on the question of legalising cannabis in specific circumstances. The bill proposes that this referendum take place on the same day as the next state election, with the prescribed question, should cannabis be legalised in Western Australia to allow for home growth and adult personal use? Throughout the current Parliament, the Legalise Cannabis Party of Western Australia has consistently put forward a case for law reform, including proposing amendments to laws such as the Misuse of Drugs Act to allow for legalisation of growing cannabis for personal use and gifting. But the government has not responded favourably to these pledges. As the elected government of the people of Western Australia, the Cook administration must therefore believe that their constituents do not support cannabis legalisation for home growth. However, opinion surveys throughout the country have repeatedly shown that this is not the case. In recent years, support for legalisation of growing cannabis for personal use and gifting has been consistently rising. This is demonstrated by the Australian Government's own data as collected through the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, undertaken periodically by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. According to the NDSHS data, a vast and rising majority of Australians think that the possession of cannabis should not be a criminal offence. In 2010, 63% of people, 68.9% in WA, were of this opinion, increasing to 78%, including 76.9% in Western Australia in 2019 and 80% in 2022-2023. Given the gap between policy and evidence pertaining to the matter of the criminalisation of cannabis possession, the Cook Government must be basing its policy in this area on different assumptions and data. This indicates some confusion, and therefore, to clarify the matter, it would be helpful to hold a referendum on the views of the people of Western Australia. A simple question added onto the election ballot asking whether electors are for or against the legalisation of cannabis possession would assist the next government to make an evidence-based policy decision to ensure that its governing decisions are in step with the will of the people. Pursuant to Standing Order 126, 1, I advise that this bill is not a uniform legislation bill. It does not ratify or give effect to bilateral or multilateral intergovernmental agreement to which the government of the state is a party, nor does this bill, by reason of its subject matter, introduce a uniform scheme or uniform laws throughout the Commonwealth. I commend this bill to the House and table the explanatory memorandum.
That explanatory memorandum is tabled and debate on the bill stands adjourned. Members, we move to item 3 on non-government business, medicinal cannabis discrimination. The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Thank you, President. So I move that this House condemns the recent decision by Rio Tinto to stipulate that none of its employees, regardless of their role or location, may continue in their employment if they are found to be taking legally prescribed medicinal cannabis, and B, reaffirms the principle that workers across Western Australia have the right to receive the very best standards of medical care, which should be guided by qualified medical professionals and not by corporate CEOs.
The Honourable Sophia Mormont has moved that motion, and the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Thank you, President. So recently, Rio Tinto changed the testing regime for the presence of THC from a swab test to a urine test. So the urine test is much more sensitive than a swab test, and what that means is that those who are on medicinal cannabis will test positive even after 5 to 6 weeks since their last use. So obviously that can cause problems for people taking cannabis medicinally. Now, the reason given for this by Rio Tinto is that there are no reliable methods to determine a safe dosage for medicinal cannabis in a high-risk workplace, unlike other medications. So this has led to Rio Tinto stating that employees must first declare their use of all medicinal cannabis products as well as include inform them that they are using CBD-only preparations. Now, CBD-only does not have a psychoactive effect as such. It can help regulate people with anxiety, is very useful for pain in general, and it can help with sleep as well. But it doesn't alter the way you experience the world in any sort of way. The reason why people might use CBD-only products are numerous, and one of the reasons that they choose to go down that path may well be because THC is not allowed at their workplace. So it was quite surprising that Rio Tinto has decided to also not allow for CBD products, and I'm not quite sure what they are basing that on. Because we haven't been able to find any decent science to support the exclusion of CBD. Now, if workplace screening and confirmatory testing indicates the presence of THC, the worker may be subjected to disciplinary action, which can include termination of employment. It may also happen that that person is requested to work from home for a while. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear that the Legalise Cannabis Party as a whole, and us here today, don't want any individuals who are impaired in any way in a high-risk situation. We don't want them on the road, we don't want them in factories, and we don't want them in the mines. So safety is important, and no one should ever be put at risk. The issue here is that the testing method used is incredibly sensitive. And since THC is a fat-soluble chemical, it can last in the body, in the fat cells for quite a long time, for up to months afterwards. So even if someone hasn't had cannabis for a while, but they might be on a diet at the time of testing where the THC was actually stored in their fat cells, it can then be released and they can test positive. The other way of testing for cannabis, which is or any drug for that matter, can be a hair test, a hair analysis test. Now, they often use the root from the hair to test as well, and that once again can pick up on a wide variety of substances, but also nutritional status over quite a long period of time. So way after any effects that might have occurred due to taking cannabis in any form, and up to months, and I read one example of up to years afterwards. So that doesn't seem logical to test for that, but if you're going to use urine analysis to test for THC and you are really concerned about the level of THC present in a person because you have no idea when they are impaired or not, which is quite bizarre, you should actually be using hair testing for ultimate results and accuracy. So what has been found in general is that when people use cannabis, so if they were to smoke or vape, the effects last for about 4 to 6 hours. So people who use this going to bed, for instance, hopefully they have a really good night's sleep, they wake up in the morning and it'll be 6 to 8 hours later after going to bed, and then it would be another, I don't know, maybe an hour or two before they're actually at work and dealing with heavy machinery. So that puts it up to 10 hours after, way past that time frame of 4 to 6 hours. Now, prior to using the urine testing, they were using a swab test, the same sort of swab test that is used by the Western Australian Police and also on mine sites and in other occupational health and safety environments. So the swab test can show recent use. It picks up that 4 to 6 hour window where you may still be feeling the effects of THC. So that means that if someone is, they took it for sleep, they woke up the next day, they go to work, that test, they would be able to pass that. But that is also, at that stage, there won't be any obvious effect relating to cannabis use left over. All the effects would have worn off by then. So the tests are also quite easy and non-invasive to apply, which is why the WA Police uses that. Now, I feel if it is good enough for our road users to be considered unimpaired when they pass one of those tests, I would have thought that same level of care would be sufficient for a mining company as well. There is actually also plenty of research out there supporting what we're talking about today. The Lambert Initiative and other reports from overseas all claim that 4 to 6 hour window, depending on the method of consumption. Now, the thing is that we're talking about medicinal cannabis here. We're not talking about some other recreational drug that people might be using. This is a legally prescribed medicine for that particular person. Now, they would have been given instructions by their doctor on how to use it, okay? And their doctor, their healthcare practitioner, would know that at the dosage and following those instructions that person is not going to be a danger to society by being impaired on the road or in a factory. So in the end, though, we all want to have a good night's sleep. So I quite see the benefit of using medicinal cannabis in a mining situation because of the hours that people work at can be disruptive to their normal sleeping patterns. All right, now, Rio Tinto is the one company that we're talking about here today. It does test for opioids as well, but it is more stringent in its testing for cannabis than it is with opioids. Now, with opioids, if you test positive, they stand you down, they send you to the laboratory to test, and if it's below a certain level, you can continue with your work. So this would be easy to implement in a sense for cannabis as well. You might be able to test for impairment, specifically with like an app called Druid that tests memory, task switching, reaction speed and balance. And if someone were to be on medicinal cannabis, you would set their test up for them, they would do it every day when they come into work, and it would very clearly pick up whether they are impaired or not. Now, currently the method that Rio Tinto has chosen goes above and beyond the mine safety and inspections regulations from 1995. So other mining companies obviously find those guidelines to be sufficient, but Rio Tinto has gone beyond that. Now, we are testing for a lot of things that also cause impairment in people, and we might be talking about stress, sleep deprivation, even things like physiological conditions, if you have a cold, pain, or if you're going through menopause as a woman or andropause as a man, those conditions can affect your cognition as well. Other drugs that are commonly available that people use that may indeed affect their functioning are things like stimulants, and we're looking at nicotine and caffeine there. So imagine being a surgeon who's doing some work on the inner ear of someone, very fine work, and you've just had 3 cups of coffee. You may well have a slight tremor, okay? So I do wonder if Rio Tinto is watching what their employees are drinking in the morning before they go to work. Now, stimulants overall can make your heart beat faster, your blood pressure go up, can affect your body temperature as well, can lead to heat exhaustion or even heat stroke. Obviously, that's very pertinent in the mining industry. And once again, you're looking at sleeplessness, but the tremors are the main things that could affect functioning in a high-risk environment. We've also got sedative substances that people can just simply buy over the counter. We've got phenergan and doxylamine, which are 2 antihistamines which cross the blood-brain barrier and can cause sleepiness, drowsiness, dizziness, and overall sedation. Now, a lot of medications for pain can also affect function as well, and obviously, like I said, the opioids are tested for, but they are also commonly available. Now, the issue with some of the opioids as painkillers is that they are addictive and you may need more and more to help manage your pain. When you look at medicinal cannabis, you don't necessarily need more and more, and it is not addictive. So taking away that choice from people, what choice of medicine that they actually want to use, I feel is against their human rights. We should have a choice about what medicine we want to use, and we should not be forced into using medicines that have negative side effects for us. We've also got some other drugs that can affect function. Statins are quite a common one. They help lower cholesterol. And what is interesting about that is that your brain is about 25% cholesterol, and it is well documented that people who are starting to take statins can have memory problems. Now, I saw this both happen in my parents, and I also had treated quite a few patients who came to me stating they had started on a statin for their cholesterol, and they found that their cognition had declined because of that. Now, there's some excellent research that's been done by a lovely woman named Marianne Damasi. She spoke about the negative effects of statins on people. So cognition is one thing. The other thing that statins interfere with is muscular function. So statins interfere with the production of coenzyme Q10, which is what your muscles run on for energy. And people who start them often have quite a lot of pain in their legs, which obviously they then could take opioids for, and I'm sure that will really benefit their health in the long term. Other medications which can have quite rapid effects that are easily available are your non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, your NSAIDs, of which ibuprofen is one of those, and they can increase the risk of bleeding, affect blood pressure, kidneys, and worsen heart failures. Yet they are quite common, okay? And once again, medicinal cannabis might be a much more useful and less dangerous substance to take to help manage your pain. An interesting little fact is that drug-related deaths from prescribed drugs are more common than those for illegal drugs. And unfortunately, at the time when that statement was made, cannabis was still illegal, but nobody actually has died from cannabis. So the reason that was given by Rio Tinto was for going to urine analysis was to make sure that they're the highest level of testing available. But it actually interferes with the personal freedoms of their employees. It is also interesting to note that all of their staff is being tested. So even if you have a job at a desk where you're sitting down, you drive to work, you come into work, you sit down at a desk, you're not really doing any sort of high level security work, okay, those employees can also get fired from their job as well. And the thing is, there's a double standard there too, because we don't apply these same rules to, say, our electricians or our tradies or our plumbers, that we just can't, people that might come into our house and work with, in a high-risk situation, putting in air conditioners or putting in electricity into bathrooms or wherever else in the house that it's needed. What has been noted too is that there are people that, employees that in the mining industry that have quite a good income. They go home for their week off and they party in that week. And one of those drugs that they party with is methamphetamine. Now, methamphetamine clears from the blood and saliva in about 2 days. All right, so these people, they party hard, their sleep is interrupted, they go back to site, okay, they are fatigued and they go through a mini withdrawal at that stage. And I've had several people in the mining industry tell me that they have observed in their colleagues that the first couple of days that they're back from their break, they're actually fatigued and they need to pick up the slack. So it would make a big difference. And having spoken to some of those people who are using methamphetamine, they also would like to be able to simply use cannabis while they're at home to party with. Not that I'm saying that all of that is a good thing necessarily. I'm just saying this is what's happening out there. And those people that come back to site that are tired, sleep deprived, going through mini withdrawal are actually a high security risk, but the blood tests or urine tests won't pick up any of that. And I would think that a company like Rio Tinto would be very much interested in maintaining safety on their site, and this is something that they are not picking up on. Also, if I were to go on holidays to a country where it's legal to use cannabis recreationally and then come back, I could lose my job at that stage as well. Now, I don't think that an employer should be able to regulate what you do on your holidays or don't, especially if it is in the country that you're visiting, it is a legal activity. Impairment testing is absolutely the gold standard in occupational health and safety, and that, like I said earlier, involves memory, speed, task switching, and balance, and peripheral vision can be a part of that as well, and that would really ensure a very safe workplace and also a high level of safety on our roads as well. So I'm not quite sure why Rio Tinto has decided to go the way they have, because there is actually a lot of research out there, and employees should have the right to use the medication that they think will work best for them.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. I rise, of course, in support of my colleague, Honourable Sophia Mormont. I think I'd like to give some perspective here from a medical practitioner, because I think we could all agree that allowing people onto a mine site while impaired at a high-risk profession is not a good idea. So if people are entering a mine site who are impaired but are not detected, then the risk we would have of accidents and indeed fatalities is heightened. And if that is not being recognised, then we ought to be cognizant of that, because action needs to be taken. Now, what we're seeing just now is opening up to public vision that this may in fact be the case. We don't know. Are they testing for impairment or not? Because quite clearly, if you're using one form of testing as a proxy for impairment and you fail to detect impairment, there may well be other areas where impairment is being missed. Anyone who suggests that risk should be increased should not have a place at this particular table. We need to have safety for our workers. We need to have an accurate measurement of impairment. Now, I note that part of the reason for Rio Tinto Zinc's approach is ascribed to their adherence to the current legislation in the Road Traffic Act, where the presence of measurable THC is equivalent to impairment. Now, we know, of course, this is entirely wrong. It's false. It's provably false. But yet it is being used as a measure of risk of impairment. They go even further and suggest that CBD is also to be refused because that might affect impairment. But by the same Road Traffic Acts, we're looking at driving with CBD. They tested individual drivers to see if CBD does cause impairment. Now, in medical terms, I would prescribe something like 10, 20, maybe 200 milligrams of CBD. They tested up to 1,500 milligrams of CBD and found no measurable impairment by the tests that the police were comfortable with. Zero impairment. And yet Rio Tinto Zinc is saying they may be impaired, we're going to stop CBD as well. It's almost as bad as Hong Kong, where they've banned CBD as being a narcotic, which is completely a lie. It's scientifically false. So Rio Tinto Zinc is not a small company. It's a very professionally managed company. It must be well managed. And so there has to be medical advice for this point of view. And indeed, they have sought medical advice. I wonder how much training has actually been done. Most doctors, you see, in this country have not learned about cannabis. The endocannabinoid system is not actually taught in medical schools. So you could argue that if you have not been trained in the endocannabinoid system, you are not actually competent to prescribe cannabis. You're not actually competent to discuss cannabis because you're unaware of the science. And only less than 5% of doctors prescribe. And of those 5%, some prescribe a lot, others hardly any at all. So I wonder if it's possible that the advice they have got has been from doctors who do not know about cannabis and do not prescribe cannabis. It's a question. I put it to the chamber here. Perhaps Rio Tinto, an honourable company, is receiving advice from people who may be less than qualified, maybe even completely unqualified. I would love to be in discussion with those advising doctors to see how much actually information do you have. And I could be very happy in my assumption that there may well be deficiencies in knowledge, which, if that is then passed on to a company like Rio Tinto Zinc, may in fact be causing harm. Is it possible that harm may be caused because of incompetent or inappropriate advice? Because if someone is suggesting that the testing of urine for the risk of impairment, if someone is seriously suggesting that, then they are seriously inaccurate, inadequate, and I would put it, incompetent. Is that a problem? Yes, it is a problem. Because then people are going to make their own choices to how they manage their own health problems, like, for example, their insomnia and the resulting tiredness. Are they not going to use medications which would assist with that, which might have more deleterious side effects? And as my colleague has pointed out, that is very well what is being done. In fact, as a result of the actions of Rio Tinto Zinc and other companies like that, we are now not only the state with the highest use of methamphetamine, we are the city with the most use of methamphetamine, a totally inappropriate drug, one which causes serious harm and ought to be despised at every level. And yet, we are allowing companies to take action which results in us becoming the recipients of a methamphetamine-addicted society causing harm physical harm to the individual and to society, and who then are able to enter the mine site cleared of any presence of drug, but who are actively impaired. Now, how do I know this? I know this because, as a doctor, I listen to people who work on site. This is evidence direct from the individual, passed on to me as prescribing doctor. And more evidence could be sought that when we give cannabis to people who have got, for example, insomnia or anxiety, we actually find that there is no impairment, and B, there is an enhancement of the capacity for physical and mental work. Their abilities to perform are enhanced, and yet they're described as incompetent for work. So the unintended consequences we have got from a company trying to follow the best advice, albeit the advice may be inappropriate or incompetent or just plainly wrong, is actually causing physical harm in the community and, more of importance to the political side here, financial consequences to society in loss of earnings, loss of revenue to the government, indeed loss of lives on site. I have approached unions to see if we can get some measure of action to protect the workers whose health is being improved. And I find that unions would like to work, but they're fighting against a company which has a large clout in our business here because of the funds they provide. Indeed, we look at the balance we have got here, the $6 billion, in no small amount derived from our mining communities. And it would be, I think, a careless government which threatened that because of the threat of economic sanctions being applied by the companies who want to control, albeit in an inappropriate manner. So what we are seeing here is the need for us as a parliament and for us as a people to rise in support, not just of safety on site, that people are allowed to work on site when not impaired and banned when they are impaired. But there's a deeper thing here as well. What we have is I, as a medical practitioner with a lot of experience, I would suggest that if people doubt that, they can simply chat to me behind the chair or chat to other experienced doctors, or indeed those who have studied the biochemistry and the biology and the biochemistry of cannabis and are able to give scientific answers which are represented internationally through a variety of studies. Ask us what the actual facts are. And then when our patients turn up on site, they are then dealt with as if they were inappropriately treated. The medical advice, the qualified, the experienced, the appropriate medical advice is being rejected by a company which is not medically qualified and advised by doctors who are possibly not medically competent to have an opinion about cannabis. Thereby, we as a parliament, if we are unable to take any action, we're basically tacitly saying that the company has the power to declare a qualified doctor's decisions and recommendations inappropriate. And I've yet to see a member of the board of Rio Tinto Zinc possessing anything in the way of medical qualifications. And I'd like very much to see that the quality of the doctors who are giving advice has been checked for their ability to actually hold their own in a debate with a doctor who is appropriately qualified and experienced in prescribing a healthy healing herb, which can, at times, used improperly, cause impairment. But used properly under medical direction enhances wellness, enhances their ability to work unimpaired, and whose opinion is now being overruled by red tape, by blind adherence to HR rules created by people who do not possess the information required.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, President. And I stand on behalf of the government to give the government response to the Honourable Sophia Mormon's motion regarding medicinal cannabis and the recent decision, or as described in the motion, the recent decision by Rio Tinto. What I will say, members, you haven't provided us with very much context to work with here. You've talked about a decision of Rio Tinto's, but you provided no material to the Parliament regarding that particular thing. That makes it very hard for other members to make a contribution based on what you describe as the decision, and also to understand the providence of where this is coming from. So you've both spoken quite passionately, as you always do, regarding this matter, but what's not before the Parliament right now is the materials that you rely on to condemn the decision of Rio Tinto. Now, I was a member of the Cannabis and Hemp Committee, Select Committee, along with you, member. That's the Honourable Brian Walker, for the sake of Hansard, and I was certainly party to the recommendations that were, and I still stand by the recommendations of that committee, particularly in relation to recommendation 10, or 9 and 10, which 9 was Demers review its publication, the Alcohol and Other Drugs in the Workplace Guidance Note, with a view to developing and publishing more comprehensive and contemporary guidance workplace materials. I'm not sure if that's what it says. And recommendation 10, Demers and peak industry bodies develop printed online resources for employers to explain the difference between medicinal cannabis and recreational marijuana, providing information about how THC does and does not affect impairment, and recommending that medicinal cannabis be treated in the same manner as other potentially impairing prescription drugs. And I don't reconcile from the recommendations that I put my name to when that report was published. What I can do is update the House to some degree about the work of Demers in relation to the guidance note. That is a matter that Demers and WorkSafe is working on. It hasn't yet been finalised, so I can't give that indication of when it will be published. But the original document that was referred to was published in 2008 and addresses cannabis only as a recreational drug. And I think it's acknowledged that that was well outdated, given that in 2016 medicinal cannabis became a lawful prescribable medication in this jurisdiction, and that people seeing their GP could, or a specialist at that time, get a prescription for a medicinal cannabis product. And the report, as I say, made that particular recommendation to update that guidance note. And as I say, I can confirm that Demers is continuing to work on that. There is a chain of work that is, sorry, if I can put it, there's a train of work, and I would expect sometime in the not too distant future for that guidance note to be published. And I think so I'll put that to one side. What I will say in relation to the Honourable Dr. Brian Walker, he made a number of aspersions or dispersions regarding the potential experience of the people who would be providing advice, or the expertise of the people providing advice to Rio Tinto regarding this matter. Now, remember, I don't know what you've done to go to Rio Tinto and ask them to engage with you on this issue. In my experience, their government relations branch is quite active. I remember in the last Parliament being involved in a motion with the Honourable Kyle McGinn about automation, and we got a call for a briefing not very long after that by Rio Tinto to tell us all about their automation and how good it was. I think members, if I could give you any gratuitous and unsolicited advice, I would get in contact with Rio Tinto to discuss your concerns with what you say is their particular policy. I don't know that this is the best forum to be debating those sorts of things. Now, it's certainly permissible to put the kind of motion that you've put up before this House, but one of the things that doesn't happen in the course of that is that the subject of the motion, Rio Tinto, doesn't have a right of reply. It cannot address its own concerns. And it's not my job to defend the actions of Rio Tinto in terms of this particular matter, but I think it behoves both of you to reach out to them. If you have not already done so, it behoves you to reach out and to give your concerns and to address some of the matters that you've raised here with them directly. Rio Tinto is a very large company. It has an important place in both the economic health of this state, but obviously it engages many people on its work sites, which benefits people across all of our electorates. And so they're an important company in that particular regard. But they, as every other PCBU, which is what they are, has a responsibility for the work health and safety of all people that work on their sites and all people that interact with their work sites. And yes, they have a responsibility to the individual workers that might be using medicinal cannabis products under the guidance of their particular doctor, but what they need to also do is ensure that those particular workers, when interacting with the workplaces, are doing so in a safe manner. Now, you can take issue with where they've drawn the line on this, but I wouldn't take issue with their motives. I think what they're trying to do is to ensure that they meet their responsibility for a safe workplace. And as I say, with a lack of further context to understand where Rio Tinto is with all of these matters, I think all the government can do in response to your motion is make some general statements about what the position of this government is on medicinal cannabis. The position of the government has been to support the legalisation and the access to medicinal cannabis. The original decision in 2016 was a decision of the former government. But obviously further decisions have been made since that time by the McGowan Labor government in support of medicinal cannabis being made available to people. But also this government is extremely concerned and has made a number of legislative reforms in the work health and safety space, and we are very focused on ensuring that basic tenet that every worker that goes to work should be able to come home in the same state that they left. And I think that's the key here in terms of the context here, is that we want employers to take their responsibilities for workplace health and safety seriously. We want them to make sure that they put practices and policies in place that give effect to that. Those practices and policies, of course, should be fair and lawful. As I say, I'm not sure that Rio has met the benchmark that you've set them in terms of condemning them for their particular actions here. We also want people to obviously listen to their medical practitioners that prescribe a course of medication, and that they should be free of unnecessary or unlawful discrimination in their workplace for following their doctor's advice. However, we must recognise that all medications can impact people's capacity to perform their work safely, and if there is a circumstance where that arises, then it is incumbent on the individual worker to raise that with their employer, to discuss it with their treating doctors, and to ensure that the workplace that they go into is safe. So, members, we cannot support your motion in the way that it is drafted. We certainly have some sympathy for some elements of it in terms of what you're putting forward, certainly the bit about the House reaffirming the principles that workers across West Australia have the right to receive the very best standards of medical care, which should be guided by qualified medical professionals. I don't think anybody would take any issue with that particular part of your motion, but in totality we can't support what you've done here. And again, I encourage you to reach out to Rio Tinto to have the discussion with them, if you have not already done so, to raise your particular concerns.
The question is the motion be agreed. There is a point of order.
Acting President, thank you. The honourable member has reminded me of my inability to follow Standing Orders 20(2). I had promised to table the paper, the Rio Tinto Medical Cannabis Guidance Note, and I had failed to do that. I would ask to be able to seek leave to table that paper, albeit belatedly.
The honourable member has sought leave to table that paper. Is leave granted? That paper is tabled. The question is the motion be agreed. If there are no further speakers, the Honourable Colm again.
Acting President. I'd like a copy of that too. Acting President, thank you. It was pretty obvious before we even got the motion yesterday what we were going to be talking about today, and that is something that I have to say I've appreciated about the two members, that you have stuck very true to the name of your party and have managed to talk about cannabis in almost every single debate in this parliament, which really got me when you tried to introduce CBD into a fishing debate, which I thought was spectacular. But look, this is quite an interesting motion, and funny enough, I have quite a connection to it from my past employment, which was a union official in the Pilbara for the MUA, and not usage, remember. Look, what I will say is we have come a long way. So I know, for example, just talking from experience, that you were very commonly engaged as a union official in disciplinary meetings for breaches of drug policies, particularly through the Pilbara region. And what I discovered very early, and I agree with the Honourable Sophia Mormont, is that there were a lot of people who joined the resource sector that had engaged in recreational use of cannabis as either on whatever scale that was, but that for them was what they did, as the Honourable Sophia Mormont would say, is party or socialise, whatever you want to put it that way. But what I seen representing members from 2014 was a high uptake of the use of methamphetamine. And that came because at all the sites across the Pilbara, it was urine testing. And the Honourable Sophia Mormont is very right in stating that urine testing is very invasive and does not accurately reflect impairment. I would also say that the eye testing and the hair testing is very, very much worse than urine testing as well. But what we engaged upon as a union at the time, and this was solely to protect workers, was we entered into negotiations in enterprise bargain agreements to ensure that employers switched to swab testing. Now, the reason we did that is for the health and safety of the workers. It was very evident that there was a switch from cannabis to methamphetamines. I couldn't tell you how many people told me that I represented for pissing positive to methamphetamine. Sorry, urine test, I shouldn't say that one. Urine testing to methamphetamines, and did not have a track record of that prior to starting their employment. What we did find once we, and as a union and as a bunch of workers that were negotiating an EBA, they were honest about it. That is the reasoning that we want swab testing. It is not to fool the company into being able to be high at work. It's to say what I do in my off time is what I do in my off time, and if I'm not impaired when I get to work, what is it to do with you? And we were quite successful as a union to get that testing across majority of our sites. But I will say that it was kicking and screaming. It wasn't an employer that led that chase. There was not an employer that voluntarily went ahead and did swab testing straight away. There was all the excuses under the sun. It's too expensive, it's not accurate, not even the police have accurate testing with swab testing was a famous one. Even though the police were genuinely prosecuting people with their swab testing. So, you know, you could only expect that that was a high likelihood. Acceptable to be prosecuted, but not acceptable to go to work doesn't make sense. So we're very successful in getting that put in, and I definitely found across the workplace a little bit of a reduction in representing people for methamphetamine, and I don't think that that rolled out across the mining industry. The mining industry traditionally, since the 80s and 90s, has quite a low union density. It's getting better, but without that body fighting for an enterprise agreement and getting it in your work right conditions, I don't think relying upon an employer to introduce a policy that softens any type of drug testing is ever going to be something that comes forward. I've also taken quite an interest in, and due to having to work around these type of situations quite a lot, the world standard. So what's happening around the world? And unfortunately, I have been unable to find any test of impairment for cannabis that is being used on a workplace to allow somebody with medical or without medical to enter the workplace. So whilst I have many times stood up in here and condemned Rio Tinto, unfortunately you're not going to get me doing that today, because I think it is all employers. So I don't think it's Rio Tinto specifically that is on this, this path of unaccepting of the medical cannabis. I think that the American story, the USA story, is quite intriguing because they set out on a path of medical cannabis to start with, similar to how Australia is sort of heading, but it was for very heavy sort of medical conditions, and then it loosened up into knee pain, back pain, and you know, there's plenty of stories you can see of people lining up to get medical cards and stuff like that, which then went into recreational, as we know, not federally, but in states and stuff like that. And then if you go to the States now, it's pretty common to see, smell or hear marijuana somewhere. But they still don't have an impairment test on site. So they have a huge engagement in cannabis as a whole, but they haven't got workplaces to a point where they can do impairment testing yet either. So I am very intrigued to see when they get there, because I know, for example, that they do the, if you're driving, I think it's called the sobriety test. I think that's similar for cannabis in America, and then when you get back to the station, they'll test you, and if it's in your system, it's in your system. I think it'll be very similar to our standard of testing. So as far as the world experience goes, outside of Rio Tinto, no one's got it right. No one's put into their own process the ability to allow it. There are companies that are allowing it, and not many, but there are some. And I think they do it through their own policies and procedures in a way that they accept the doctors have made a decision, that it won't impair that person if they stick to what they've been prescribed. The other problem is, how do you know that they're sticking to the dosage of a prescription? Because, you know, they could always store it up and then potentially, you know, use heavier amounts. So I think there's always going to be a speculation of that until we get to what an impairment test looks like. And that's not as simple as look left, look right, you know, reflexes, etc. And I do also acknowledge that the Honourable Sophia Mormont has a great position in respect of fatigue and other things that can happen to have you impaired at work. And I don't think we got that right either. I think that when a mine worker works 12-hour shifts and travels an hour and 10 minutes to site each way, so Cape Preston, for example, that's a 14-hour day. Now, that's a 14-hour day consistently for 2 weeks. I think we've got a major issue within fatigue management. And I think even worse is they don't get paid for that travel. So not only are you breaching the 12-hour shift rule, you're also not getting paid for it. So that sort of stuff to me doesn't sit right whatsoever. I do think that going down the rabbit hole of the other prescribed drugs was interesting. I know that there's been situations where people have got light duties when they have been prescribed opiates or something like that, where the employer says, you know, due to your injury, you're unfit for work, but you can do light duties in, say, the administration building, and they accept the medication for that period of time, but then once they go back into their heavy machinery world, they don't accept that. So I think there is other drugs, prescribed drugs, that are in that same sort of basis, and until you can really pinpoint the level of impairment, it's going to be next to impossible. But I do appreciate the motion. I do think that this conversation's got to be broader. I don't think that it's specific to Rio Tinto. I think it is a broader conversation we have to have about impairment at work as a whole, not just on cannabis. And I really do think that this was a really good motion for us to debate in the House today, but I cannot support the motion.
The question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Ewan Sidmer.
Mr Acting Deputy President. I think, obviously, points are to be awarded to the Honourable Dr Brian Walker and the Honourable Sophia Mormont for their 3 years of absolute consistency on this topic and related matters. And I also, in a charitable sense, want to provide some sympathy. I think it is very difficult when you have a limited allocation of non-government business opportunities or motions on notice opportunities as a minor party to maximise that limited time available to advocate for your particular political cause. But I think examples like today exemplify the fact that it is possible, I think, to condense too much information into limited and available time, and that is absolutely not a criticism of the movers of the motion, but effectively a reflection on the capacity to provide an intelligent and considered response to a matter which has been brought to the Chamber's attention. In fact, there were a range of issues there which probably do merit far more extensive contributions than I'm going to be able to provide in this abbreviated envelope of time. I do, however, I think it would probably be orderly for me to work perhaps in reverse because the conversation has focused on limb 3 of the motion today, the motion bit, and not the two first and second reading speeches given in relation to the two private member bills. So I'll deal with the third one first. I would absolutely concur with the sentiments expressed by the Honourable Matthew Swinburne and the Honourable Kyle McGinn in that it is very difficult to have a focused and reasonable conversation about a perceived issue, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, a perceived issue apparently with Rio Tinto's health and safety guidance, when I haven't necessarily seen the evidence of the problem, nor has it been explained the quantum of workers apparently to which this matter is problematic, which is not to say that only if there are 2 or 3 people involved it's not a problem, but it would be good to quantify the extent of the problem or the extent of the perceived issue. I have absolutely no issue with the very reasonable statement that the House reaffirms the principle that workers across Western Australia have the right to receive the very best standards of medical care, which should be guided by qualified medical professionals. No reasonable person in this chamber could possibly disagree with it. What I do have problems with, though, is I think there's a categorisation or a demonisation of CEOs as being these arbiters of evil, when effectively they are responsible for the entire operations of that company. They are responsible not only to the workforce but the shareholders, and they have to make, in fact they are obliged to make, decisions in the best interests of that company and its shareholders and its employees. That's another issue, but I think there's this sense that these invidious CEOs can dispense with or disregard all medical knowledge and are just belligerently applying a rule that they've conjured up themselves. I don't necessarily think that is an adequate or fair reflection of the situation here, and I thought the contribution by the Honourable Matthew Swinburne was excellent in that it reminded the House of the good work of the Standing Committee into Cannabis from, I think, tabled in September or so last year, from memory. A recommendation that was made that demurs revise or reconsider these issues in an orderly way, which I am reassured because I found him to be an honest member that the government is actually doing that. In the absence of an outcome of that work, I don't necessarily think, with all fairness, that we can have a reasonable and informed discussion, which is probably where I would want to leave that particular dimension. What I would make is now and I don't mean this to come across as unfair, but if the Legalise Cannabis Party actually had its way, it would actually lead to the extinguishment or the negation of your party. So the party's purpose is to extinguish itself by the achievement of its stated objectives. I've never seen a... This is probably consistent with single-issue parties, generally speaking, and that is not a criticism, but that is just an observation. So it is a very interesting political motive to work towards your own erosion. That's what a legalised cannabis party would do. But if I may, that is not entirely, though, the objective. Not entirely the objective. Because the second part of this is an interesting thing. I think there's a view to perhaps there being a perpetuation of the party in some other form, and that was the call for a referendum on the issue. Now, forgive me for being a bit cynical, but I can only imagine that the Legalised Cannabis Party calling for a referendum on the legalisation of cannabis at the same time as the next state general election would possibly work to the advantage only of one party in this chamber. And that would be your party, would it not? Because, and I do not think that necessarily is a reasonable, I mean, it's novel, but I don't think it's a reasonable or supportable view. So I cannot, I find it very difficult to justify, largely speaking, referendums on any issue because of the expense. I think the threshold for the conduct of an election, particularly at a state level, has to be exceedingly high, and I think in recent times that threshold has been set far too low, but this motion will lower it even further in my particular view. I enjoy the debate. I think the issues are worth discussing, but for the record, the opposition cannot find any reason to support the business brought forward by you lovely people today. Thank you.
The question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Peter Foster.
A short time left. I just wanted to make some comments in regards to the motion moved by the Honourable Sophia Mamon this morning. Just want to make it clear that I don't join you in condemning Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto, it's a bit of a personal thing for me because my partner works at Rio Tinto. He's worked there for 16 years up in Tom Price on the mine site. Like many families in WA, we say goodbye to our partners and they go off to the mine. And at the mine, there's explosives, there's machinery, there's trains, there's a myriad of risk at the mine site. And like many, I worry that my partner will come home safely each night. And so, as someone who has a partner that works in the mining industry, I'm particularly worried that the colleagues around them might be using substances which affect their impairment, and that they might make a decision which then affects the health and well-being of my partner. So, I won't be joining you in condemning Rio Tinto. I want to make sure that my partner comes home safe every evening, and I take great pride in the fact that they're taking measures at their work site to ensure that everybody does come home safe. They do things like Take 5, where they assess risk. They have regular State of the Nation addresses where they have an open platform with management and can bring up any concerns that they have. So if you know of a particular worker at Rio Tinto that is, enduring some difficulty at work, just encourage them to talk to management. I've certainly found Rio Tinto to be very open. I know the Honourable Matthew Swinburne encouraged you during his contribution to talk to Rio Tinto. I would also do the same thing. I would encourage you to talk to Rio Tinto. But I know there's a lot of measures that they do at work to keep the employees safe, and I'm grateful for that on a personal level, but I mean, I'm grateful that there is a company out there that is doing what it can to keep its workers safe. Last year there was the Mining Industry Summit, which was held here in WA. I got the privilege to attend that. I think a number of members attended that, and it was really great to be in a room with all the mining companies. There was union representatives, all levels of management, to really talk about the work culture at work and measures that they could do to keep people safe at work. So I know that it's a very serious conversation that people are having to keep workers safe at work. The Honourable Sophia Mamon, in her contribution, talked about whether someone was operating high-risk machinery and perhaps they should be held to a higher standard than perhaps somebody that was working in an office. Perhaps they shouldn't be subjected to the highest standard. I don't know if you've visited a mine site, but not all mine sites have buses that take their staff to work each day. A lot of mine site employees actually drive themselves, so they need to be careful if they're taking, a medication for a condition, that they're safe to even drive to work and drive home again. So I think it's a little bit irrelevant whether they're in an office or not, because they still could potentially be driving to work or driving home again. But also in the office is management. They could be making decisions which affect people's lives as well. So I don't think we can really say that people in heavy machinery should be to a higher standard than perhaps someone that's working in an office, because they all ultimately are responsible for themselves, but for others around them. I remember a number of years ago, there was an issue with synthetic drugs. Rio Tinto does do regular testing, and that's been discussed today. But there was an issue with synthetic drugs. People were ordering drugs through the post because they knew that they couldn't take the real thing because that would come up in a test. So they took the synthetic and to try and get around the rules. And that was really worrying for me personally, because we potentially had people that were working on the mine site taking these synthetic drugs to try and get past the testing. And that's quite nefarious. Thankfully, Rio Tinto then adjusted its testing so that it was able to pick up these synthetic drugs. I mean, people were so creative. I've heard stories of where people were purchasing urine through the post, getting it delivered to work, having it under their shirt, and when it was time for a drug test, they'd be squirting the urine into the jar. Really, really disgusting. But that's the sort of things that people would do to be creative to pass their drug tests. So I'll leave my contribution there. I want to thank Rio Tinto for all the actions that it does do to keep workers safe, including my own partner. Thank you.
Question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Sandra Carr.
I rise, obviously, not to support the motion, but really just to thank the Honourable Sophia Momond for raising and providing opportunity for the debate and the discussion. I think that our other members on both sides of the chamber have explained some of the issues with the challenges in supporting a motion like that. But I did think it was important just to make a couple of points. One is, I think the appreciation of the subject matter is reflected in the calm and considered nature of the debate today. It's unusual for a Thursday, I should add. And I do recognise some of the issues around the challenges that mining industries face with workers and the ways that they need to try and manage and look for and care for their well-being. I do note that often when we are regionally advocating for workers to be housed around in those regional locations, one of the arguments that I've heard from various industry, and particularly mining industry, is that they like to have their worker housing on site to manage alcohol consumption, because if they're in the community and then they're visiting pubs and that kind of thing. So I find that an interesting and challenging conversation as well, because the thing that really concerns me is when people are self-medicating in that way, what is the reason they're doing that? What is it about FIFO work that this is such a substantive topic and a substantive cause of even mining companies adapting behaviour? And perhaps we need to take steps even further back and look at the way that mining companies are providing opportunity for workers, and that in the past, when I was young, used to involve workers living up in communities, being able to play sport, bringing their families and having their families with them. Interestingly, I was listening to an article, a post this morning, and it was talking about, it caught my attention because it said, do you want to live to be 100? And it said, if you want to live to 100, have a look at the people around you, your connections, because it's that human connection and your social network that is a strong indicator of your longevity and your well-being. And I think and that just got me thinking about this motion today, which is why I jumped to my feet. And that is because when we're having people in FIFO, they're so disconnected from community that perhaps we need to have a think about what is the cause of people self-medicating in those circumstances, and what is it that we can do better as a whole community to make sure that people working in those industries are able to engage in the full spectrum of opportunities in life, to be really engaged in community, to not feel the need to self-medicate, to make themselves feel better, or to deal with what is a very challenging lifestyle, in that you're part of a community for a moment or part of your family for 1-2 weeks, and then you're gone again and you're living this whole different world. And then you're back again, but you can't really deeply embed yourself and connect in all of those beautiful human relationships that those of us who are very, very lucky to be working in their home and in their community and playing sport and on boards and on committees, or engaging in social activities that they can schedule into their weekly calendar. I think that is something that perhaps we can step even further back and look at what is the reason that we have this issue amongst particularly the mining industry, and what is it that is pushing people to feel like they need to self-medicate in that way.
There is a brief time for reply from the mover of the motion, the Honourable Sophia Mamond.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the honourable members for their considered responses. I very much appreciate it. I thought it was very interesting to hear about the history in regards to the union movement from the Honourable Carl, and also from the Honourable Senator Carr in regards to how the mining industry and FIFO work in particular affects the well-being of the employees. So I also just want to state that I'm aware that we've been told that 1/3 of our tax dollars come from the mining industry, and it is very hard to imagine our life with 1/3 less of the infrastructure and benefits that that provides to us.
Member, time for debate on that motion has lapsed. You may